Hello, and welcome to today's episode on the Mycenaeans, Homer's historic heroes. Today we are going to be looking back at one of the civilizations that many people think served as the inspiration for the warrior kings in Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So, what we're going to do today, we're going to start by contextualizing this civilization, the Mycenaeans, within the broader scope of Bronze Age culture. From there, we're going to take a look at the Palace of Mycenae, the best preserved and kind of type site of Bronze Age culture on the Greek mainland. From there, we'll start looking at what the burials at Mycenae look like, the grave goods, and start considering what they can tell us about culture, Mycenaean culture in the Bronze Age. And then finally, we're going to make our way across the Peloponnese to the site of sandy Pylos, where we see some of the tablets and some of the written evidence that helps us fill out our idea of what Bronze Age culture on the Greek mainland looked like. So, let's start by getting our kind of chronological date here. We are still in the Bronze Age, and for us, that runs from around 3000 BC to around 1200 BC. Now, in the scope of the Bronze Age, we want to remember that the Aegean, the Greek world, was always somewhat of a backwater. Compared to Egypt down here, or Mesopotamia over here, or even Turkey in the Hittite Empire up here in Anatolia, the Greek world gets a rather late start. And so we can see with Egypt that by 2500 BC, we've already seen the greatest of the Egyptian pyramids. And that's about 1,000 years before we ever get the palaces that we associate with Minoan Crete or Mycenaean Greece. More contemporary with those palaces is New Kingdom Egypt. And this is the time where the pharaohs started to expand beyond the borders of Egypt up into the Levant, pushing all the way up towards Anatolia, where they came into contact with the Hittite Empire. And what we're looking at here, right, is the most famous of archaeological remains of those New Kingdom kings, and that's the burial mask of King Tut. Now, you might remember him for that mask. We learned earlier that what he's really known for historically is kind of moving Egypt away from the heretic, Akhenaten, his father, who placed full religious emphasis on the sun disk and back towards kind of a normal approach to Egyptian culture and religion and politics. Now, what we looked at last time was we looked at the Minoans on the island of Crete in the southern Aegean. And what we're going to do today is move a little bit north to the Greek mainland, where we're going to look at the Mycenaean culture. Now, when we looked at the Minoans, we talked a little bit about kind of this weird idea that they get their name from this mythological king Minos, from which we also get the Minotaur. And we talked through the mythology surrounding the origin of that name, the origin of the Minotaur, and eventually the kingdom of the Minoans. We also talked about Minoan material culture. So everything from the palace up here at the site of Knossos to the way those palaces are decorated with these very vivid floral and faunal frescoes that we can see up here with dolphins, with the bull leaping scene down here. And these bulls were a core component of Minoan culture. And we can see those in frescoes and in statuettes and in seals and in architectural horns of consecration, where we believe they made sacrifices, integrating the bull into some sort of religious ritual. Now, the Mycenaeans, well, they weren't quite as creative with where we get our cultural name here. And so we call the Mycenaeans because their main site is the site of Mycenae. Perhaps not the most creative thing ever, but easy to remember that way. And that's what you're looking at right here. So the site of Mycenae up in the northern Peloponnese in Greece. Now this, like the Minoan palaces, this is the best known, but it's just one of many palaces throughout the Greek mainland that we consider part of the Mycenaean culture. Now, here what we're looking at is a recreation of that palace, all right? And so you can see some of the subsidiary buildings around the outside, the wall down here, and then the kind of central part, right, the political part of the palace at the highest point in the center. And what I want you to start thinking about is how this compares and contrasts to what we were looking at with Minoan palaces, such as the one at the site of Knossos. So think about that, think if you can remember it. If you can't remember it, let this refresh your memory. So this is what we're looking at, a recreation of the Minoan palace at Knossos here. So take a few seconds, think about both of these. What's similar about them? What's different about them? And this is going to be a running theme in terms of what we do, this kind of comparing and contrasting between times and places with material culture. Now, one of the main things you might have noticed is that the Mycenaean palaces have massive walls, whereas the Minoan palaces, kind of strangely, have no walls at all. And in those Mycenaean palaces, we call these cyclopean walls because of the sheer size of the stone used to build them. The kind of thinking being that only a cyclops could lift such heavy rocks. And that actually comes out of one of the episodes in the Odyssey, where after Odysseus tricks the Cyclops Polyphemus, leaving his cave underneath the sheep and yelling that no man has tricked him this day, the Cyclops, now blinded, starts throwing rocks from the cliffside, trying to sink the ship of Odysseus. And so kind of from that, we get these terms of cyclopean walls, where only a Cyclops such as Polyphemus here could lift such stones. Now, amongst these cyclopean walls at the site of Mycenae, we get the only monumental sculpture we have in the Mycenaean world. And that's what you're looking at here with this monumental lion sculpture above what we call the Lion's Gate. Again, not the most creative term ever, at the site of Mycenae. And this is cool, A, because it's the only monumental sculpture we have, and it kind of attests to the ferocity of the kings of this site, right? The fierceness of a lion, but also for its kind of architectural purpose as well. This isn't just for decoration. What we're looking at here is actually a relieving sculpture that takes some of the weight away from what would be above the lintel, right? So the lintel is what sits above the two door pillars or the door jambs there. And this is lighter than what would have been there if they just used the standard load of stones. So kind of a cool way to represent the kind of iconography of Mycenaean culture with the lions here, while at the same time architecturally making it a more sturdy and more stable structure. Now, at the site of Mycenae, we get one of the great characters of early archaeology. And that's a man by the name of Heinrich Schliemann. Now, Heinrich Schliemann was the excavator at Mycenae, as well as the site of Troy. And he's kind of the prototypical classical archaeologist of the late 1800s, early 1900s, trowel in one hand, a copy of the Iliad in the other hand, searching for Homer's inspiration, right? Where did he get the characters and the sites from which he composed his epics? Now, you can see him juxtaposed with the site of Mycenae, the Lion's Gate there. And one of the crazy things that Heinrich Schliemann did, in addition to excavating these sites, was these were the Wild West days of archaeology. And so he used to take treasure from the sites. This is actually from the site of Troy, something we call Priam's treasure. Priam was the king of Troy, so this would have been the jewelry for his wife. And Heinrich Schliemann here has dressed his own wife up in the treasure from the site itself to take photos of her and publicize his excavations. Now, at the site of Mycenae, right, the prototypical Mycenaean site, one of the major areas he excavated were these royal shaft graves. And so you can see the walls around one of these right over here. And the way this would have worked is that you get a big round or kind of semi-round enclosure, and then the shaft would have been sunk maybe 30 feet deep into the center of this. and at the bottom there would have been a chamber for burial. And while it looks like just a pile of stones today, the things that we get out of these shaft graves are quite remarkable. The most famous of these things is something that Heinrich Schliemann himself called the Mask of Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae in Homer's Iliad. Now, this is just his thought that this is the Mask of Agamemnon here. But what we do have is we have a gold burial mask that we assume is associated with a royal burial for the ruling king at Mycenae sometime during the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. Now, one of the things that's happened in recent years when we're looking at a mask, this particular mask, is people have started to question whether or not this is actually a fake. And the reason for that is they've found other golden masks along with the Mask of Agamemnon down here. So we see one over here, kind of a bald smiling guy, a not so smiling guy in the center here, and then a rather upset guy over here on the side. And so scholars have started to think that first and foremost, the beard on the Mask of Agamemnon may actually be more reminiscent of the hairstyles, of the beard styles of Heinrich Schliemann's own time, rather than the hairstyle or beard style of ruling people in antiquity, because you'll notice none of the other ones have beards on it. Also, the kind of fully rounded shape that we see here isn't quite as evident in the Mask of Agamemnon. Nevertheless, regardless of whether that particular artifact is a fake or not, the shaft graves at Mycenae held truly remarkable finds in terms of just the level of craftsmanship of the jewelry. So here you can see kind of different golden adornments here, the level of filigree on the gold, and then kind of the remarkable construction of some of the warlike militaristic artifacts that were found within the graves. So on the left here, what you can see these inlaid daggers, all right? So we've got these daggers, and on the daggers, we actually see hunting scenes. So they're hunting lions on the daggers there. Over here, what we see is a helmet, a war helmet, and these are actually made out of the tusks. This is made out of the tusks of a wild boar, all right? And so already with the grave goods here, we see something quite different than what we see with Minoan material culture. There we talked about how it was remarkable that their cities have no walls at all, how their iconography is these floral and faunal kind of motifs with dolphins and octopuses and weird blue monkeys and things like that. Here we have artifacts having to do with fighting, right? Having to do with warfare and hunting, even depicting more warfare and hunting. So kind of a core difference between this Minoan idea of peacefulness, hence calling them the hippies of the Bronze Age, and this Mycenaean idea of militarism. Now, that's building off of what we're getting from the material culture, from the archaeological record. When we look at Mycenaean culture, one of the very cool things that we have is also a set of texts to complement the archaeological record. And these come from the site of Pylos in the southwestern Peloponnese. We'll take a look at that in just a second. Now, we're lucky to have these at all. These were actually inscribed when the clay was still wet, and they were never meant to be fired to be preserved. It just happened that the palace burnt down while these clay tablets were still wet, and that burning, that firing process, just like pottery today, that's what preserves them for archaeologists and historians to look through. And when we look at these, what we end up seeing is something that kind of builds on our idea of the way that Mycenaean society worked. And that's very similar to Minoan culture. What we're getting is a redistributive economy, all right? So these all are essentially accounting receipts, people sending things to the palace, and then the palace redistributing them to the people, right? So if you raise goats, you send a bunch of goats to the palace, those goats get distributed to a bunch of other people, and in return, you're getting other types of goods that you might not be raising on your own. Now, where we're moving from right here, this red dot is the site of Mycenae. We're gonna take our Bronze Age chariot across the Peloponnese, that's that big peninsula down here, and we're ending up in the southwest at Pylos, where in addition to these tablets, we're also finding another palace. And I want you to start thinking about how this palace compares to some of the other ones that we've seen. How does this compare to Mycenae? And this gives you a sense for what Mycenae looks like, for what Pylos looks like, and start thinking once again about the similarities and differences between these two Mycenaean palaces. And one of the biggest differences is you'll notice that kind of like a Minoan palace, the palace at Pylos has no large defensive walls, whereas the palace at Mycenae has these kind of monumental walls surrounding the entire Acropolis here. And you can see that once again when we look at the plan of Pylos, centered on this great room with this giant hearth in the center of the city, or in the center of the palace. And we can look here at what a recreation of that room looks like. In Mycenaean architecture, this is what we call the megaron. This is where the king would sit. It very frequently has a throne. It's got 4 big columns in the center of the room. There's a giant hearth that would sit in the middle of those columns. And then there's an open space in the roof for the flame to go out through the ceiling. And this was essentially the center of Mycenaean palatial architecture. And it's really well exemplified at the site of Pylos. So let's think about where we are now. So we've talked about Mycenaean culture and especially the type site of Mycenae. And at that site, we found these kind of unbelievable artifacts, such as the possibly fake mask of Agamemnon, as well as a number of other kind of gold burial masks. We've also talked about how the palaces, the Mycenaean palaces, right, compare and contrast to those of the Minoan world. And similarly, what we end up getting is we do think that they also had this kind of redistributive economy, and that is kind of advanced by the find of these tablets at the site of Pylos, where we're getting goods being sent to the palace, and then the palace sending the goods back out to the people. In a very different way, however, one of the things that we're seeing in Mycenaean culture is this focus on warfare. And so we can see that in the Cyclopean walls, which Minoan palaces don't have. And we can also see it in the artifacts, right? These inlaid daggers or the boar's tusk helmets that are accompanying the grave goods at the site. And so while they're similar in a lot of ways, large palaces for a political elite, a sense of a redistributive economy where goods flow into the palace and then back out to the people, we also see some major differences, whereas Mycenaean culture seems to be very warfare-centered and militaristic. Minoan culture, with its floral and faunal motifs and its lack of walls, could be considered kind of the hippies of the Bronze Age. And so that's where we are with the Aegean Bronze Age, both on the Mycenaean mainland and Minoan Crete.